Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're taking a look at a Monoblack deck, which is possible thanks to a whole bunch of new additions from Revolt, like Fatal Push and Gifted Aetherborn. And this also means that our mana base is very simple, just 23 swamps, which means all our lands come into play untapped. We don't have any mana issues as long as we draw enough lands. And this also rewards a deck that's trying to be more proactive, trying to curve out. And that's what this deck is, so you'll see a bunch of vehicles trying to be aggressive here. We also get access to a lot of the very efficient removal spells in black. So let's dive right into it here, starting out with Fatal Push, a new addition from Revolt. Very efficient removal spell, kills creatures with converted mana cost 2 or less, and with Revolt enabled, converted mana cost 4 or less. And we do have a few ways of enabling Revolt to power up our Fatal Push as well. Then we get to some of our 2-drop creatures. We've got Asylum Visitor, 2 mana 3/1, that has Madness, can also perhaps draw us into some more cards. So a pretty sweet 2-drop. And we do also have cards like Smuggler, Copter to enable Madness. We also have Carrier Thrall, which is kind of a weird inclusion. It's not the most powerful 2-drop ever, but it does work well with our small sacrifice theme that we have in the deck, since when the Carrier Thrall dies, we still get a 1/1 Scion token that can also perhaps keep crewing our vehicles, maybe ramps us into some of our more expensive cards. So the Carrier Thrall has some good uses in the deck. We also have Gifted Aetherborn, just a very efficient and powerful creature, 2/3 Death Touch and Lifelink, so good against aggressive decks, but also good against the decks trying to play bigger creatures, since he can just trade for one, and yeah, just a great creature all around. Then we also have Scrapheap Scrounger, a great card, very annoying for control decks to deal with, since he keeps coming back from the graveyard, and even if the opponent has bigger creatures out, you can perhaps still crew a vehicle with the Scrapheap Scrounger, and that way you can still get some uses out of the Scrapheap Scrounger. Then of course we're also playing Smuggler Copter, just a great card in pretty much any color. Flying 3/3 can let us improve our hand with the draw and discard ability, and very easy to crew, can even crew it with a Scion token. Then we also have Grasp of Darkness, another very efficient removal spell for double black, giving a creature -4/-4 until end of turn. We're also playing a Liliana Heretical Healer, since we do have a few ways of sacrificing our own creatures, which makes it easier to transform Liliana. And then she transforms into a Defiant Necromancer, which can also do a whole bunch of neat things. We're also playing Yahenni, Undying Partisan from Revolt, also a great addition, 2/2 haste, so can get in there right away. And when a creature the opponent controls dies, she gets a +1/+1 counter, and then we can also sacrifice another creature we control to give Yahenni indestructible until end of turn. So that's also where some cards like Carrier Thrall come in handy, since you can sacrifice it twice with the Scion token you get. We're also playing the full amount of Fleshbag Marauder, yet another removal spell, but this can also become a creature if you've got something else to sacrifice. So for 2 and a black, each player sacrifices a creature, so also works nicely with cards like Carrier Thrall, and some of the other cards we'll get to in a second. Another neat interaction in this deck with Fleshbag Marauder is that you can crew vehicles while the trigger is still on the stack. That way you can still attack with your vehicle and sacrifice a Marauder if you don't have anything else you want to sacrifice. So that's a neat little interaction that comes up quite a bit. We also have 2 copies of Murder to kind of round out our removal suite. We also have 1 copy of Read the Bones, just for those grindy games where you want to draw some more cards. Also 1 copy of Liliana the Last Hope, to shrink down opposing creatures, maybe take out 1 toughness creatures and return cards from our graveyard. And of course the ultimate is also great. We also have Erebos' Titan, another card you see very often, but in a mono black deck it's not that difficult to play this on turn 4. So this is a 5/5 that has indestructible as long as the opponent doesn't control any creatures, so great against control decks. And then the other ability is not gonna come up very often, but yeah, I guess it's there. We also have Kalitas, Traitor of Ghet, another creature that works very well with all our cheap removal spells. making a zombie token whenever an opponent's creature dies and exiling that creature. Then we get to some more of our vehicles. 2 copies of Fleethweel Cruiser, 4 mana, 5/3, trample haste, gets in there right away, and then the crew cost is only 2, so pretty easy to crew the Fleethweel Cruiser. Then we have 2 copies of Priest of the Blood Rite, which for 5 mana gets us a total of 7 power and 7 toughness, a 2/2 on the ground, and a 5/5 demon token in the air. So we actually kind of want to sacrifice the Priest of the Blood Rite, but luckily we have a lot of cards that can allow us to sacrifice a Priest, like Fleshbag Marauder and Yahenni, and we even have an Emerge card we'll get to in a second. So getting rid of the 2/2 is not a problem, and if we're against a control deck, for example, then we don't really care about losing 2 life, and then the extra 2/2 creature can be very useful. We also have a Skysovereign Consul Flagship, which we can easily crew with our 3-powered creatures, and this is a 6/5 flying that deals 3 damage when it enters the battlefield to a creature or planeswalker, and when it attacks. So if this can stick around for a couple turns, it's gonna decimate the opponent's board. We also get Ob Nixilis Reignited to deal with creatures and draw some more cards. And finally, the spicy copy of Distended Mindbender, which works very well with Priest of the Blood Rite, since then the Emerge cost will only be 2 since it's reduced by 5. And when it enters the battlefield, the opponent has to reveal their hand, and we get to take a card with converted mana cost 3 or less, and one with converted mana cost 4 or greater, and make the opponent discard those. So a pretty great card if you can play this in a timely manner. And then of course our mana base, pretty easy, 23 swamps, don't want too many of them, since we don't really want to flood out, but we do want to get up to maybe 5 mana to cast some of our more expensive spells. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which looks pretty good. Do want some more lands here, but we can cast a lot of 2-drops that are pretty good. Question is, which 2-drop do we lead with? Probably the Copter, as we see our opponent getting a swamp. Fleshbag has some nice synergies with this hand, like the Thrall and the Yahenni. Can even crew the Copter in response. Primal Druid, alright, so our Fleshbag just got a little bit worse, since we don't want the opponent to sacrifice that one. So yeah, I think it's an easy Smuggler's Copter here. Still haven't found land number 3, but hopefully the Copter can help there. So let's see if the opponent is gonna keep up a removal spell for the Copter, or if they're just going to play something, as we see a Plains into Grapple with the Past. So they're not gonna keep up a removal spell here. They get back a Hissing Quagmire, so it looks like a graveyard deck of sorts. Alright, land is good. The most mana efficient play is probably Yahenni, and then crew the Copter and look for lands. And what do we discard here? I think I want to keep the Grasp. Maybe the Fleshbag is a little clunky with this hand. I would rather have the cheaper cards. So let's discard that one. And it's also not great against the Primal Druid. So we're in a decent position, I would say, but our opponent could do something scary here. Tapped Hissing Quagmire and nothing else, so opponent could easily be holding up a removal spell, which means we probably just want to present 2 good threats. So we could just play the Cruiser and then crew the Copter, attack with both, and the opponent has to choose which creature they want to kill. Could also just play Liliana and play a more controlling game, but I think we want to be proactive here. So yeah, let's just slam the cruiser and make the opponent choose which vehicle they want to kill. And looks like they are going with the Copter rather than the cruiser. They might have some blockers on the ground that can take care of the cruiser. Or they just want to get rid of their Primal Druid to get an extra land. Which is fine. Opponent did also take 3 from that Anguished Unmaking, so they are pretty low already. And our Yahenni got a little bigger. So let's see what the opponent can do with 6 mana here. Explosive Vegetation, so our opponent's not happy with 6 mana, they want to go to 8. And anything else? A Vessel of Nascency. Alright, so opponent's setting up for a big turn next turn. So we just have to try and kill them as quickly as possible. Which means we can play the Thrall to crew and still play out our Liliana to diversify our threats a bit. And I think I like the Thrall here since that gives us 2 ways to sacrifice with Yahenni. And it's not like the lifelink is really gonna matter here. So let's go for it. Attack for 8. And I think we do play Liliana. Opponent could easily have sweeper effects, in which case diversifying our threats a bit is better. And I don't think we want to minus yet, I think we just plus here for now. And let's see our opponent's big finish. They start by sacrificing the Vessel. Finds Blessed Alliance tracker and lands. They can only take the tracker or the lands. And looks like they took the tracker. There's the Tireless tracker, which is just gonna die to our Grasp of Darkness. So unless our opponent has some significant interaction with their remaining 3 mana, I think we should be able to close out the game here. So let's just use a Grasp. Opponent sacks a clue. But even if they find a Fatal Push here, that's not gonna be enough. As Yahenni grows larger, can even crew, could even have crewed with Aetherborn here if we wanted to, and get in for 9. Alright, so we got a nice little curve out there with a bunch of vehicles, removal when we needed it, and there we go, on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which has a lot of removal and a few creatures, so I think it's probably good enough. Hopefully our opponent doesn't have a lot of removal, otherwise this game is gonna go long, and I don't know if we're favored in most long games. But if they're on a mono red deck, this hand should pretty much destroy them. And I think I actually will Fatal Push right now. Could wait and try and get a 2-for-1, get fancy, but if we just stick this Aetherborn and get a hidden, we should already be favored. And if the opponent spends their turn removing the Aetherborn, that's also fine. So let's see if the opponent has a removal spell, or if they're just gonna try and develop their board first. Majoring Bully. Alright, Majoring Bully is not a problem, so I think we just play out the Yahenni, and we could offer the trade here, but I don't think we want to, so instead we'll just hit with the Aetherborn. And then next turn we can play out our removal spell and kill the bully. But if this Yahenni survives, then I like our position, as we see Call of the Full Moon on the Majoring Bully. That's not gonna end well for them. +3/+2 on the bully, so we'll take 6. Opponent can't cast a second spell here or the Call of the Full Moon will fall off. We could use Grasp of Darkness, but if the opponent has a pump spell, they can still save the bully. So instead, Fatal Push is probably just a safer option altogether. Attack for 5. Opponent falls to 13, we gain 2. Up to 18, and we have a decent board state plus a removal spell in hand. Abbot of Carol Keep is going to reveal a Goblin Glory Chaser. Alright, that's fine. They play him out. But now a Grasp of Darkness on the Abbots means Yahenni grows up to a 4/4. Can hit for 6. And we could actually use this other grasp on the Glory Chaser to make Yahenni one bigger. But 6/7 next turn is still lethal, so it doesn't actually speed up our clock, and if our opponent puts another enchantment on the Glory Chaser, we can get another 2/1. And we kind of want to save the grasp to get rid of a potential blocker, like this Majoring Bully. Or this Goblin Arsonist, so opponents won't be dead the next turn. Opponent does get in there with the Glory Chaser. And becomes Renowned. So I think just for the sake of mana efficiency we want to kill the bully here. And this also means that if we find a land we can win with the Flagship. There we go. Take care of the Arsonist. So yeah, I would say things went pretty well for us. Our removal lined up very nicely with the opponent's creatures, and we completely destroyed them since they didn't have answers for our creatures. So ending the game at 20 life against the mono-red deck doesn't happen very often, but there you go. On to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which looks acceptable. Don't have any super powerful cards here, but a nice synergy between the Thrall and the Fleshbag, some removal. So let's see how we fare. Our opponent leads with a Vessel of Nascency. Alright, Yahenni is a nice addition. So if the opponent doesn't present something we need to kill with the Flashbag, we can play Yahenni on turn 3. And here we have to find out if we want to use the Grasp on this Smuggler Copter or if we just want to play out the Thrall. Because if we just leave up 2 mana, it's also very likely that our opponent doesn't crew with the Copter, respecting a removal spell, so we would just be wasting our mana. So I think we just take the hit from the Copter here. And then we can perhaps use a Flashback to get rid of the creature our opponent played to crew the Copter. Otherwise we maybe just play out the Yahenni. As we see Liliana, the Last Hope, and it's actually a little awkward since that gets rid of our 1 toughness creature here. But we will be able to pressure Liliana with our Yahenni at least. As we find our own Liliana, which is not great in the face of an active Smuggler Copter. So let's just play out our Yahenni and attack Liliana for 3. And now when our opponent goes to kill our Scion token, we can still sack it to Yahenni to make her indestructible. opponent doesn't have a removal spell in response for the Yahenni. And nothing else, alright. So our opponent could be holding up a removal spell right now. But the problem is, if we go to play a creature to maybe give the Yahenni indestructible, our opponent can just respond with the removal spell, so that's not gonna work out. So I think we just move to combat and hope for the best. Opponent sacks the vessel. Maybe they have a fatal push here. As their opponent has to choose what card to get. And yep, there's a fatal push, so that's unfortunate. So now we're left with some pretty bad options. So I think we just Liliana here and try to get back the Yahenni. Unless we find something better. Found an Asylum Visitor. 1 toughness dice to Liliana. So let's get back our Yahenni. And Liliana's probably gonna die to one of these creatures. As we see Reclamation Sage, which is not gonna kill anything, but is gonna crew the Copter to take out our Liliana. Our opponent's Liliana gonna go up to 3, which means Yahenni can put her to 1, and we'll still have a Grasp of Darkness to take out either the Sage or the Copter, which will also grow the Yahenni. So actually no, we can play Yahenni, kill the Sage, make Yahenni into a 3/3 to take down the Liliana. The only problem with that line is if our opponent has a fatal push, they can kill the Yahenni, since we will have enabled Revolt for them by killing the Reclamation Sage. It's a little risky to go for the Grasp on the Reclamation Sage, but now that our opponent's tapped out, that line is a lot safer. The only problem here now is if we do go for the Yahenni line, then we use our only removal spell on the Smuggler's Copter, so we won't have anything for that. But of course the Priest of the Blood Rite, the 5/5 demon, can just block the Smuggler's Copter. So I actually don't hate going with the aggressive Yahenni plus Grasp line, just to get rid of that annoying Liliana. And then next turn we can play out the Priest. The game is still pretty undecided, could go either way here. Kind of depends if our opponent can make a big play here. As they sacrifice Vessel, find Walking Ballista, Tireless Tracker. I'm guessing they take the Tireless Tracker, but they might want the Ballista to be able to crew the Copter right now. And yep, they did take the Tireless Tracker. And Fatal Push is gonna work because they enabled Revolt by sacrificing the Vessel. So actually, had they left up that black mana last turn, they might have been able to take out Yahenni before she killed Liliana. But now we're just gonna play out the Priest. And next turn we have the Fleshbag lined up to sacrifice the Priest itself. And if our opponent plays out the Tireless Tracker plus a land from the Renegade map, being able to kill the Tracker with the Flashbag is going to be pretty nice. Of course, our opponent could choose to crew the Smuggler's Copter in response to sacrifice that instead of the Tireless Tracker, but we'll find out. So there's a Tracker, there's a land. Of course, Fatal Push can also take care of our Demon token here, unfortunately. And we see Smuggler's Copter getting in there. But now that does mean that our opponent can no longer sacrifice a Smuggler's Copter when we play out our Fleshbag Marauder. So we will be able to kill the Tracker here. As we see another Reclamation Sage discarded. So we don't want to draw any more lands here, that's unfortunate. So let's attack for 2. Play the Flashbag and trade creatures. Now that we drew these 2 lands that we don't need, our opponent is pretty far ahead. But that could change at a moment's notice. If we find a creature like Scrapheap Scrounger that can keep getting in there, that would be nice. Instead we see a pretty big one from the opponent, Mindwreck Demon, which can crew the Copter, is also just a 4/5, so can deal a lot of damage very quickly. And of course Delirium is enabled. So our opponent with a number of fatal pushes in the early game. In fact, all 3 fatal pushes. Alright, there's a scrap heap we asked for. So let's hit for 3 and... well, now we pretty much need to find removal spells for the rest of the game to deal with the demon and the Copter. As we see Gifted Aetherborn, which can block our 2-drops nicely. Can also crew the Copter if our opponent wants to. Opponent does decide to be aggressive here, can deal a 7 down to 5. And we will be dead to the flyers if we don't find a removal spell. Opponent of course improving their hand every turn with the Copter, discarding excess lands. And another land here is gonna be too much for us to handle. Can attack for 6. Represents removal spells, but you can represent all the removal spells you want, but if you don't have them, then you're not gonna win. As we see another Aetherborn. Copter gets crewed, and now we are just very dead. But the early game was pretty interesting with all the interactions with our Yahenni. So on to the next one. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which I think is acceptable. A little heavy on the lands here. Don't really want to draw too many more lands, but we do have a curve of Scrapheap into Liliana into Erebos' Titan, which is pretty good. As we see a Renegade map from the opponent out of a blue deck with a Tezzeret icon. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say their opponent is playing a blue-black artifact deck. Flashbag is not a bad pickup if our opponent plays a must-kill creature next turn. Instead we might just see something like a removal spell, a fatal push on our scrap heap. Let's attack first. Opponent could also have a metallic rebuke. Instead it's just a fatal push, which is fine. So I think we'll just play out our Liliana, start plussing her, make our opponent come up with a creature. And next turn this Erebos' Titan could be pretty good if our opponent doesn't have any creatures. Opponent gets a plains with the Renegade map, so they're actually Esper colors at the very least. So that does mean they could have something like an Anguished Unmaking to deal with our Liliana. Could be holding up a counterspell here. If they have a counterspell, playing the Erebos' Titan is not great, since this is great against removal spells and not counterspells. If your opponent instead has a removal spell, playing the Fleethweel Cruiser is not great. So can't really tell if her opponent's on a counterspell build. Would have to be something like a Metallic Rebuke here, but I think I'll go with the Fleethweel Cruiser rather than the Titan. And yep, there we see the Metallic Rebuke. So pretty happy with that exchange. Another reason to maybe play the Titan is that if it gets countered, we can get back the Scrapheap. But plussing Liliana is also just pretty good here. And there we see the Anguished Unmaking I was afraid of to take out our Liliana. But now we can resolve the Titan. Opponent doesn't have any creatures in play. So that means our Titan is now indestructible. Could still die to an Anguished Unmaking, of course, since that exiles. But yeah, still a 5/5 that our opponent has to deal with. Key to the city, that's fine. So our opponent can maybe draw some extra cards. And there we see a Kalitas, which is also great. So let's go ahead and attack for 5. Put the opponent to 12. And I think we just want to play the Scrapheap. Our opponent could be keeping up another Metallic Rebuke here between the 2 mana and the artifact. So if we just play the Scrapheap, we can just play around the Metallic Rebuke. But that does mean that we don't get to play anything else here. If our opponent kills the Scrapheap, we can get 1 back from the graveyard by exiling the other one. Instead they just say go. So we'll attack for 8. And opponent drops all the way to 4, so I think I'm okay playing the Kalitas here. If he gets countered or killed, like with this other Metallic Rebuke, we still have the Scrapheap that can return from the graveyard. And that's probably gonna be game, especially with Erebos' Titan, which is indestructible. Yep, Artificer's Epiphany is fine. So should have returned the Scrapheap end of turn there, but I don't think it's gonna matter. We just saw the strength of these anti-control cards like Scrapheap and Erebos' Titan. Alright, sweet. I wanna thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this gameplay, and as always, have a nice day.